All right, everybody, here we are with chapter 5, I believe, of Poppy. It's called Leaving Grey House. But before we read it, I just want to remind you of the lay of the land. So the two brown um, arrows point to where the story started. So it was up on Bannock Hill that Poppy and Ragweed were when Ragweed got snatched by Mr. Okax. Now they're at Grey House with the family. What I've circled in red is Okax's watching tree. So uh, Poppy and her dad, Lungwort, are going to have to head up the tar road and cross the bridge to try and get to Okax's watching tree to ask him permission. And then up in yellow on that, I have Newhouse kind of highlighted. So that's the place that Lungwort mentioned in the first part of or in the last chapter about that's where they're going to ask permission to go to take part of the family to Newhouse because they're thinking that there will be more food. So here we go with chapter 5, Leaving Grey House. For the next 2 days, Lungwort worked on the speech he intended to make to Mr. Okax. He did this in his study, an old boot that Farmer Lamoutte had left behind the front hall steps. After lining the boot with potato sacking, Lungwort had chewed out a couple of windows, then used a plaid necktie to curtain the entryway. Now and again he emerged, papers in hand. Seeking out older members of the family, he'd corner them and say, I need you to listen to this. After reading a paragraph or two, he insisted upon knowing what the listener thought. If there were compliments, he said something like, No, I don't want flattery. I can't use that. I need hard criticism. But when he received criticism, he always argued that his way was best. Then off he'd go, in a grump, to make minute subtractions or additions to his text, none of which had anything to do with either compliments or criticism. While Lungwort prepared his speech, a committee busied itself making a white flag. No one knew whether a flag of this kind was Lungwort's idea or Mr. Okax's demand. Even so, whenever there was such a permission party, as the younger mice called it, a crisp new flag was carried so Mr. Okax would have no doubt as to the mice's intentions. It would be Poppy's job to march along with their father, bearing the flag. Poppy, meanwhile, did what she'd been told to do, relating the facts of Ragweed's death to all the family. Everyone was upset by the story. Being eaten by Mr. Okax was a shared nightmare. Moreover, it happened with some regularity. They were all scared of him. There was considerable tut-tutting and much whisker twitching, yet, while everyone expressed sorrow, Poppy suspected that few grieved. Worst were the words of comfort that began, Well, if someone had to be sacrificed. I don't understand why they disliked Ragweed so, Poppy protested sadly to Basil the night before she and Lungwort were to go see Mr. Okax. What harm did Ragweed do to them? Well, I can think of three things, Basil replied. He was a golden mouse, not a deer mouse. He came from somewhere else. And he said things that upset them. Like, you haven't lived unless you die for something. Remember what he told old Plum? A soft belly causes softness at both ends. But I liked that he was different, Poppy confessed. He loved adventure. I'll never forget the last words he ever spoke to me. They were so terribly ironic. What's ironic? When the words mean almost the opposite of what you're saying. The last thing he said to me was, You don't know how to live like I do. What's ironic about that? Basil asked him. The next second, Mr. Okax killed him. Oh, Basil shuddered. Now, Poppy, her mother began as she brushed her daughter's fur for a final time, above all, do exactly what your father tells you to do. Be respectful toward Mr. Okax if he takes notice of you. But if he does not, don't fret. Your father commands his attention. Mr. Okax has great respect for your father. Don't so much as squeak until you're spoken to, and then be humble and brief. Remember the old saying, nice should be nice. And for heaven's sake, keep the white flag flying. Above all, Sweet Cicely concluded, remember, it's an honor that you were selected to go. Yes, mother, Poppy replied, though what her mother was saying made her very uncomfortable. Lungwort appeared at that moment. His hair was slicked down, his whiskers were crisply curled, his tail had been scrubbed to a glowing pink. His thimble hat was set at a natty angle. Is she ready? He asked his wife. I think so. Lungwort examined his daughter with a critical eye. Fine, he said. A good start promises a good finish. All right, mother, we should be off. Sweet Cicely gave Lungwort a nuzzle, whispering, Do be careful. Careful is my middle name, Lungwort assured her, and led the way to the porch. There the whole family had assembled for a send-off. Fireflies had been gathered and now released, and gave a moment of festive mood. Poppy, holding the flag, stood at the foot of the porch steps. Lungwort scampered atop the old porch rail and faced the crowd. So you can see Lungwort kind of sitting up on the rail, and then down at the bottom on the right, you'll see Poppy holding the flag. My fellow mice, he began, paws clasped comfortably over his plump belly while he surveyed his family with solemn regard. I am about to leave for my meeting with Mr. Oakhacks. Need I remind you how important is this deputation? A moment for the multitude of mice to memorize. Poppy, unable to make much sense of the words, stopped listening. She was searching for Basil in the crowd. Be certain, Lungwort continued, that I will go forward with your best intentions at heart. I have prepared a fine speech that will, I'm sure, convince him of our needs. He held up a paper scroll, wrapped carefully in leaves to protect it. I look forward to returning with Mr. Oakhacks' kind permission, so at least half of us can move on to a new home. That will be a great day for all of us. At this point, he looked down at Poppy. Poppy, he cried, raise up the flag. What? The flag, Poppy, the flag. Oh, Poppy lifted the white banner high, looking at it. All she could think of was a flag of surrender. As Lungwort took his place before her, one of the crowd called out, Hip, hip, hooray, cried the others. Hip, hip, hooray. Forward, Lungwort cried. He gave a smart nod to Poppy, and they began to march off. The crowd continued to cheer. Poppy had to admit it was grand. When she caught sight of Basil waving frantically to catch her eye, she even felt proud. Within moments, however, everything changed. Grey House, with its cheerful lights and well-wishers, vanished behind them. The moon had all but disappeared behind clouds that promised rain. No stars were visible. The air felt as heavy as wet wool. In the darkness, Poppy had no idea of which direction they were to go. We'll be taking the tar road, Lungwort informed her. Fewer obstructions, more visibility. Do we have a meeting place, she asked. The very tip of Dimwood Forest, her father said, just on the far side of the bridge over Glitter Creek. And there we see it. Mr. Oakhacks' watching tree. He's there most nights. Can't miss it. It's a huge dead oak. How come it's dead? It was hit by lightning. Was Mr. Oakhacks on the tree at the time? Lungwort chuckled. Poppy, there are those who say Mr. Oakhacks made the lightning himself. He's that kind of bird. Now, my dear, do keep that flag up. Poppy tried, but she was wondering what kind of chance they'd have with an owl who made his own lightning. Marching down the middle of the road made her nervous. Surely Mr. Oakhacks would see them. Would he recognize her? If he did, would he attack? What should she do then? Run? Where? Ashamed to have such worries, Poppy decided it would be better to hide them. She said nothing. Still, it was hard to keep the heavy flag high. Up! Lungwort kept calling. He was now walking behind her. They had been marching for some time, during which they had exchanged only a few words, when the night silence was suddenly shattered by a hoo, hoo. Startled, Poppy stopped short. In the confusion, Lungwort banged into her. He lost his thimble cap and his speech. She dropped the flag. Pick up the flag, her father cried, searching and finding both thimble and speech in the darkness. Lose the flag and we're done for. Do you think he's seen us? Why else do you think he called? Lungwort snapped. The hair along Poppy's spine stood straight up. It wasn't the owl's call that frightened her as much as the fear she heard suddenly in her father's voice. Never had she heard that before. She peered around him. He didn't appear scared. Poppy sighed. She decided she must have imagined it, seen in him what she was feeling. The call came again. Whoo, whoo. Poppy, her heart pounding, asked, how much farther to go? Quite a ways, Lungwort whispered. They listened again. No more calls came. Lungwort adjusted his hat and gave a forced chuckle. Actually, I suspect that call was just some good-natured joshing. Papa? What? I'm glad you're here. Lungwort replied, but Poppy sensed that he was pleased. She felt better until he said, but do keep that flag up. The owl's call came again. For a second time, Poppy stopped. Her father did too. They listened intently for a few moments. Then Lungwort whispered, just as I thought. He's joking. Lighten up, child. And they moved on. Poppy didn't like to contradict her father, but she doubted that Mr. Oacax's calls were a joke. She rather suspected the owl was trying to scare them. And as far as she was concerned, he was succeeding. Rain began. It came softly at first, but when a clap of thunder burst right overhead, making them jump, the drizzle turned into a deluge. Within seconds, they were soaked. The tar-covered road ran with water. The flag became heavier and spattered with mud. Shake out the flag, Lungwort cried. It must stay white. Poppy tried to do as she was told, but it was difficult. They trudged on. Off to the left, flashes of lightning allowed Poppy to see the tall trees of Dimwood Forest. Although she, like all the mice, was well aware of the forest, she had never visited it. Who would want to? She'd been taught too many fearsome things about its vast size, its dreadful darkness, the fact that Mr. Oacax had a secret home there. Equally alarming was the knowledge that Dimwood Forest was full of the animals that hunted mice, like porcupines. Poppy made herself look in another direction. We're getting close, her father said, his voice tense. Poppy cocked an ear. Over the continual splash of rain, she heard the rushing waters of Glitter Creek. Then the tar road twisted sharply to the left. They had reached the bridge, a row of heavy wooden planks thrown across the creek. The gaps between the planks were wide enough for a mouse to fall through. Lungwort chose the middle plank, and Poppy followed. Despite her best intentions, she couldn't keep from peeking down. Normally, Glitter Creek was serene. The summer rains had made it high, fast, and fairly roaring. Poppy stole a nervous glance at her father. He had stopped to pull at his whiskers. She had never seen him so agitated and wondered suddenly if he would be able to protect her. She'd never asked the question before, never had to. Just to think it upset her. She looked to her father for reassurance, but all she saw was his frailty. She knew then that he was just as frightened as she was. The realization made her stomach ache with tension. Lungwort caught her looking at him. Flag! He cried, moving forward. Poppy managed to lever the flag up just as she stepped off the bridge. The moment she did, the air was rent with yet another of Mr. Oacax's cries. Hoo! Hoo! There he is! Lungwort exclaimed. Poppy looked up. As the lightning flashed and the thunder rumbled, Mr. Oacax's dead oak seemed to leap toward them. Against the darkness of Dimwood, she saw that the owl's branch reached out like a claw. As for Mr. Oacax, his head feathers were erect, making him look like a devil. Don't give way, Poppy said fiercely to herself, even as she trembled. Don't give way. And that is the end of chapter 5.